Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Seventh Moon by Marius Gabriel. Narrated by Nancy Wu. Prologue, 1972. Early morning and the traffic was grinding through Kowloon. Francine sat in the back of her Rolls-Royce, reading the South China Morning Post, while her driver, Ka Tai, fidgeted and muttered impatiently at the congestion. Every street, every alley, every inch of sidewalk was choked. A city of 5 million souls was going to work in a brown murk of traffic fumes. The sun had risen, but was already turning to blood among the storm clouds that were sweeping in from China. Ka Tai hammered the Rolls horn, sending a blast of indignation into the general ocean of noise. Francine looked up from her paper. The car in front of them had stopped, and the driver had darted out to buy spirit money from a roadside stall. The stall was piled with models of desirable possessions, houses, cars, horses, furniture, all exquisitely made from paper. "There's no hurry," Francine commanded. "Let him buy." "Sorry, Mum," Ka Tai said, easing off the horn. Across half of Southeast Asia, her servants, her employees, even some of her many business partners, called her Mum, as though she were a British lady from a time when the Pacific Rim was a colonial lake and not an awesome generator of global wealth. And she suspected that no matter what they said, that was what she would always be to them: a Guailo, a Gaijin, a Farang, a foreign devil. Her mother had been Chinese, her father an Englishman. She used her British name, Francine Lawrence. Her Chinese name, Li Yufa, was no more than a vestige, a sad relic that could be neither used nor thrown away. At 50, she was compact and energetic. Her dark hair was bobbed so that only part of its natural waves showed. She had a distinctive face, oval, with a full mouth and cloudy green eyes. There had been no shortage of men who had desired her for her beauty, although these days they sometimes couldn't see past her wealth and power. The financial papers had christened her Niu Huang, the Empress, a sobriquet she detested. She was still building her empire and expected to keep building it for another 40 years or so. She had no children. It sometimes occurred to her to wonder who would inherit it when she died. But that question did not usually trouble her for long. She was alone in this world, and she was not building her empire for anyone else. She was building it for herself. Her achievement, her refuge, her memorial. The man in front of them was still haggling. It was the festival of the hungry ghosts, when the gates of the underworld opened to let out the spirits of those who had died far from their families, without comforts to take with them. They came begging, thronging the air, invisible and hungry. She was struck by an impulse. "Ka Tai, buy me some spirit money." "Yes, ma'am," Ka Tai said without surprise. "What else shall I get?" "An airplane, a horse, toys, food, clothes." "Yes, ma'am." He got out of the Rolls and hurried over to the old man's stall. The telephone set into the walnut panel beside her began to ring. Francine lifted it, pulling the spiral cord across her lap. "Yes." "Good morning, ma'am." Francine checked her wristwatch. The business day that was just beginning here in Hong Kong had already ended in Manhattan. "Good evening, Cecilia. Why are you still in the office? Is anything wrong?" "Something came up at closing time." "Yes?" There was a brief pause. "A visitor, a young lady from Borneo." "From Borneo?" "She said you last met a long time ago, in Sarawak." Francine's skin was suddenly cold. "Is she there now?" "No. She left when I told her you were out of the office." "But you talked to her?" We talked for a short while. What kind of young lady was this? A young Sarani lady, Cecilia said. She had used the Malay word for a Eurasian. Cecilia Tan had been with Francine for more than 15 years, since the early days in Singapore, and there was a bond of trust and understanding between them. Can you describe her? Very pretty, a good figure. She wore a miniskirt and a jacket. Not expensive, but nice. What color eyes? Cecilia paused. I don't remember. I'm sorry. Francine could hear the tension in Cecilia's voice. She was only here a short while. What did she call herself? She said her name was Sakura Ueda. That is a Japanese name. Yes, she said she had lived in Japan for a long time, but she said she once had another name. What name? Francine whispered. She said she would tell you when she met you. Did she leave a card? An address? No. She said she would call again when you were back in New York. I told her you would be here next Tuesday. Francine felt that she had been robbed of breath. There was an aching, hollow place in her chest. At the periphery of her vision, the traffic of Hong Kong rolled past her, silenced by the roll's insulation. But she was seeing another road, another time. Mem, are you still there? She had been silent for so long that Cecilia was worried. It was an effort to speak. Yes, I'm here. Mechanically, she checked her watch. I'll call you later tonight, when I get home. Yes, ma'am. Her hands were shaking as she replaced the unit in its cradle. She felt numb. Could it be possible? Could such things happen? She had resigned away hope in a deliberate act some years ago. Before then, she had once had dreams something like this. The pain of awakening had been terrible as the joy of the dreams. She did not want to awaken now. Yet, she knew it was not a dream. She had come so far along the road of life and had lost so much on the way that she was no longer afraid of further loss. But she was afraid of the torturer. Hope. Ma'am? She looked up blankly. Ka Tai had opened the door of the rolls, wrinkles of distress extending from his forehead over his cropped scalp. Are you all right, ma'am? She raised her hands to her face and pressed her palms hard into her eyes. Yes, I'm fine. He had an armful of papier-mâché miniatures. I got these things. He passed the models back to her. He had bought what she'd asked for. Flimsy tokens of everything she would have given, everything she would have done. An airplane, a horse, toys, food, clothes, money, everything. She laid the things on the seat beside her. Let's go now, quickly. The storm had raged all day, a monsoon tumult of driving rain. It ran in rivers down the plate glass windows while she ate, alone in her lacquered dining room that evening. She had first been based in Tsim Sha Tsui. The relentless pressure on housing had sent property prices spiraling upward in the early 1960s, and in 1966 she had relocated the factory to a new industrial estate at Tai Po, and sold the small original site to a hotel company for a $5 million profit. Much of that profit had gone straight back into the business, but she had also been lucky enough to buy herself the new apartment on Victoria Peak, using financial muscle to beat the influence-weighted bids from the colonial government and the Hongs. It was a 9-room eyrie with a spacious balcony commanding a sweeping view of the harbor, The building had a pool on the roof, and she had bought parking for 2 cars in the basement. But Francine loved it most for its natural setting. From the carefully tended communal garden, she could walk straight into forests of bamboo, fern, and wild hibiscus. She could watch kites and hawks gliding on the thermals 2,000 feet above the harbor. But now, her eyes saw nothing of the beauty around her. She had rehearsed Cecilia's few words so many times in her mind that they had started to lose their meaning, and she was almost afraid that she had misinterpreted them, heard them in some meaning that they'd never had. A young Sarani lady. During 20 years spent building her business, many people had tried to deceive her, but none had ever tried this particular prank before. Very few people, she supposed, even knew where and how she had passed the war. There had once been a colorful feature about her in the South China Morning Post, but like many who had suffered, she did not make a habit of broadcasting her experiences. She had buried them in her own memory, and she had hidden them from others. But those words unleashed a flood of pictures, hideous and gorgeous, terrible and sweet. Very pretty, a good figure. She wore a miniskirt and a jacket. Not expensive, but nice. She said she had lived in Japan for a long time. She could not stop thinking of that. Japan. The one explanation she had never considered. The one place she had never searched. Could that one word contain the truth? It could not be. Such a thing was impossible. They had found some creature and had prepared her to repeat parrot-like what they taught her. No doubt she looked right. No doubt they expected golden results, a rich harvest for the work they had put in. Or perhaps the girl, whoever she was, had dreamed it up herself. Perhaps she was a cunning and skilled actress, prepared to risk eventual discovery for a brief admittance to the treasury. The woman had not said that she was Ruth. Of course not. This was a preliminary move, a coat-trailing exercise to lay down the scent. Claim to be Ruth in front of Cecilia Tan? Of course not. She would save that dramatic moment for Francine, not waste it on a secretary. But Ruth had been dead for nearly 3 decades. A Japanese bayonet had taken her life. Her body had disintegrated in the jungle, eaten by beasts, or covered in a hasty, shallow grave. Nothing remained of her. Not even a photograph. Tears. For so long strangers to Francine, were perilously close. It was a lie. It must be a lie. The housekeeper came in to clear the table, and Francine went to her study. The storm had quieted to a soft rain. She picked up the telephone and called Cecilia Tan. It would be mid-morning in New York. Cecilia had been waiting for her call. Her voice was excited, and she spoke quickly in Cantonese. After I spoke to you last night, I wrote down every single thing I could recall about this person's appearance. I also wrote down everything she said, as exactly as I can remember it. Do you want me to? No. Francine cut in flatly. I don't want to hear any more about her. Ma'am? Cecilia said in astonishment. She's an imposter. Cecilia's voice rose. She did not give that impression. Would she have a placard around her neck saying liar? Francine retorted. You told her I would be back in the office next week? Yes. Good. Contact Clay Monroe. If the woman comes back, I want him to follow her. I want him to find out who she is, who she speaks to, where she goes. I want to know everything about her. I want him to keep a daily updated dossier on her, with photographs. Naturally, I would prefer that she not be aware of any of this, but it doesn't really matter if she does find out. And what shall I tell her?" "Tell her I'm not available." "I think you should at least see this young lady," Cecilia said. Her voice had changed from that of an efficient secretary to that of someone advising an old friend who is going wrong. "Before you do any of this, you should see her and listen to her." "No." "She did not give the impression of being an imposter. She made no claims." "That will come later." "There is something about this person." "Cecilia, do as I ask you, and please do not presume to advise me on my private life." Francine had spoken calmly, but the words were meant to cut. "Tell Clay Monroe I'll be in touch with him next week." "Yes, ma'am," Cecilia said without inflection. "I know what I'm doing, Cecilia," Francine said, more gently. "Goodbye." She hung up and rose from the desk. She had done the best thing she could have done. She believed that. Something caught her eye. The pile of paper spirit possessions she had made Ka-Tai buy earlier. She stared at them for a moment. Then she took them, beautifully crafted things that weighed nothing, and stacked them in the fireplace. She almost never lit fires, so she had to hunt for matches. She found a box in the kitchen. She lit the pile. Yellow flames leaped up swiftly. The emblems twisted, shriveled, leaped through ashes into the spirit world. Then they were gone. Francine was aware for the first time of physical weariness. She went to her bedroom and opened the main alarm console, which was close to her bed. She turned the key to arm the system. As always, she stayed to watch the rows of little green lights wink on one by one, signaling that each door, each window, each entrance was secure. When she was sure that she was locked safe within her electronic stockade, she went to bed to face whatever dreams might come. 1941. Babe in Arms. Francine looked down into Ruth's face. The child was sleeping peacefully. The morning was sultry, threatening monsoon rain at any moment. Her mother's sisters squatted on the bamboo mat in a circle, all talking at once. Francine was not listening properly because she was focused on Ruth, but one word kept exploding like a gunshot in the talk. Nippon. The Cantonese phrases rose and fell around it like flocks of birds, fluttering up in sudden fright, settling gingerly, fluttering again. 2 nights ago, the Japanese had attacked the American base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. America was now at war with Japan. At the same time, the Japanese had struck much closer, at Kota Baru, a town on the other side of the Malay Peninsula, a mere 150 miles away. The official British line was that the Japanese had been repulsed. But wild rumors, brought on the monsoon winds, were blowing around the kampong. Aunt Yin Ho, who was the undisputed matriarch of the clan, cleared her throat and spat out of the door. "They are less than 100 miles away. England's day is done." "Auntie!" several of the women exclaimed in dismay. They were all Peranakan, born in the Straits, educated in English, loyal to the English crown. Yin Ho lifted a finger. "The Japanese are coming, Yufa." That was Francine's Chinese name. "Tell your husband. You and he should go away. Tell him." Francine nodded. The aunties were all much older than she was, and the details of her birth and marriage, English father, English husband, gave her a low status here, even though she was now mistress of the general manager's bungalow at the Imperial Tin Mine. "Yes, Auntie." Francine came in to Ipoh every week, bringing little Ruth. She left with baskets of fruit and food prepared by the older women. For the past few weeks, she had also been entrusted with dire warnings to carry to Frank about the Japanese. Frank laughed and asked, what did a load of nonias know about war and international politics? But Francine had been born in the kampong, and she knew the kampong voices were wise. She touched the face of the child sleeping in her lap. Francine had married Frank at 17, and Ruth had been born 9 months later. She was just 4 years old. Ruth was a baptized Methodist. But on all the important occasions of her life, Francine had taken Ruth to the Buddhist temple, where the devout burned joss sticks and pasted gold leaf to statues already thick with gold. Frank disapproved of the idea of Ruth being taken into heathen temples. If, when he took Ruth in his arms when he came home in the evening, he caught a snatch of incense in her dark hair or found a flake of gold leaf on her little fingertips, he would be angry. What hurt Francine most was when the aunts predicted that she was no more than a temporary wife, that one day Frank would marry a European woman and have European children, and that they would never see him again. That was what Francine's father had done to her mother. She remembered her father as an affectionate, generous man. Yet when his contract had ended, he had gone back to England, and apart from the 20 straight dollars a month that always came, they had never seen or heard of him again. Once, when she had asked her mother for the 1,000th time where her father was, her mother had banged her fist on the box where she kept the receipts and had replied bitterly, "He is in here." And Francine had known that the $20 a month was all she would ever know of him from then on. And that was the unspoken theme that underlay almost all the aunts' nagging. Since the death of Francine's mother, they were her moral and spiritual guardians. Though Francine knew there could not possibly be any truth in what they said about Frank, it filled her with unease nonetheless. The eyelids of the child in her arms fluttered. "Mama?" "Mama's here," she said softly. Ruth was arrestingly beautiful. Her skin was pale gold. Her hair was thick and gleaming brown. She had inherited Francine's oval face and full mouth. Her eyes were almond-shaped and dark-lashed, set over high cheekbones, yet their color was not brown, but silver-gray. Even at her tender years, Ruth could pass neither as fully Chinese nor as fully European. Like Francine, Ruth would stand uneasily between two races, despised by the British, only tolerated by the Chinese. She would be enriched by two cultures, and yet she would be excluded by both. She heard a car engine and checked the pretty little gold wristwatch, Swiss and expensive, that Frank had bought her when Ruth had been born. It was time to go back. The taxi threaded its way through the trees toward the house. In its wake ran a throng of naked children, to whom a car was a marvel. The aunts came down the rickety steps to say goodbye, 5 middle-aged Chinese women in drab pantsuits, puffing on small metal pipes. The chatter did not cease. It was Chin Yin-ho's voice that rose above the others. "Yufa, tell your husband to send you away." She pinched Ruth's flushed cheek. "Let him take you and the child to England to stay with his family. Unless, of course, he is too ashamed to show you to them." For once, either because she was nervous or because she was exasperated, Francine was impatient with an older relative. "Frank isn't ashamed of anything." Yin-ho sniffed. "Then let him take you. You know what the Japanese do to Chinese women who marry white men." They crammed the baskets into the taxi and waved from the back window as it drove away. Ruth nestled up against her mother. "Are we going away, Mama?" "Auntie sees bad people behind every bush," Francine said irritably.
Are the Japanese bad people?
Don't worry, my darling. Mama will look after you. Perhaps we'll all take a holiday in England. She changed out of her kampong clothes into the skirt and blouse that Frank was used to seeing her in. He came home early. The food was still on the stove, the table not laid, the servants chattering. As soon as he got out of the car and walked up the drive, she knew something was wrong. She knew his face. She hurried to meet him as he came in. "Bad news, darling," he said, kissing her. Frank Lawrence was a tall, rangy man in his late 30s. He looked older because his face was weather-beaten. His eyes were a deep blue, the whites slightly yellowed by the chronic malaria from which he, like so many other mining engineers, suffered. Squinting against the sun had etched deep crow's feet at his temples, and had bracketed his wide mouth with 2 curving lines. "What's the bad news?" she asked in dread. "The Prince of Wales and the Repulse are gone, sunk by Japanese torpedo bombers." Francine's hand went to her mouth. "It can't be." She turned on the radio. As the valves warmed up, announcers' voices faded in from the ether, drawling calmly. 2 great ships indeed, the whole Royal Navy presence in Malaya had gone. The news had the impact of a vast natural disaster, a flood, a chasm opening in the earth. Francine could feel the pounding of her heart. "The aunties say the Japanese are less than 100 miles away." "Yes," Frank said. "We all know they can't wait to see the Japanese crowing on the dunghill."
"How can you say that, after what the Japanese have been doing in China?"
she exclaimed. The Malay kitchen staff had stopped clattering around the stove and were standing in silence. Becoming aware of this, Frank switched off the radio. He took Francine's arm and led her away from the kitchen door. "Watch what you say, old girl," he said in a low voice, "or this lot will take to the hills. You and Ruth will go down to Singapore. Mohammed will drive you down in the Ford. You'll stay at Raffles. You love Raffles. Remember our honeymoon?"
"We were together for our honeymoon."
"Don't worry about going in on your own," he said. "Any trouble, refer them to me, all right?"
"And you?"
"I have things to do here."
"What things?"
she demanded. "My job. I can't just drop everything."
"You could shut down the mine," she said. "Give the workers a couple of weeks' wages and let them go to their homes for a while. That way, everybody would be out of danger."
"And what would the owners say about that?"
"The way things are going, the owners are going to lose the mine anyway," she said bluntly.
"Is that what your old nonyas are saying in the kampong?" he said scornfully. "I can't come down with you, and that's that. My first duty is to the owners."
"A bunch of fat businessmen in Manchester."
"You haven't joined the Kuomintang, have you, old girl?" he said dryly. "You sound like a bloody communist."
Little Ruth piped up, her face alarmed. "Don't say bad words, Daddy." "We won't leave you," Francine said quietly. Frank patted her cheek. "Now, don't be silly. There's no danger at all. I just want you and Ruth out of the way of any panic. You'll be better off down there. As soon as the situation gets back to normal again, you can both come back home." "And if the situation doesn't get back to normal?" Frank paused, glancing at Ruth. "Then, of course, I'll join you in Singapore," he said. "But it won't come to that." "It might well come to that. And it might well be too late by then. We have to go together, Frank. Don't we count for more than the mine and the owners?" He cocked his head at her. "What's that old poem? I could not love thee, dear, so much. Loved I not honor more. Know it?" "There's no honor in a mine, Frank. Don't be a fool." Frank stiffened. He was not used to having her argue with him in this way. She had joined the mine at 16 as a humble clerk. Frank had been dazzled by her, and she had not worked for very long.
but Frank had given up a lot for his
Sample complete. Ready to continue?